Have you ever stopped to think about how the ways we communicate, from ancient clay tablets right up to the internet now, might actually be shaping, well, everything?
Shaping our societies? Yeah. How we see history, even our sense of time.
Exactly. What if there are these subtle fierces, these biases baked into the tech itself, influencing empires rising and falling?
Well, that's precisely what we're diving into today.
We're exploring the really relevant ideas of Harold Innis, especially from his big work, The Bias of Communication.
That's right. And Ennis, he's a thinker whose insights are, well, arguably just as critical now as when they first came out. Essential reading, really, if you want to understand media and communication on a deeper level.
Okay,
So our mission here is to pull out the key ideas. We've got excerpts from The Bias of Communication, an introduction to a later edition, some biographical stuff too,
the goal be
to give you those aha moments. Get the core knowledge quickly but properly, without drowning you in detail. And we'll explore Ennis' pretty unique, sometimes quite critical take on history, tech, and society.
Okay, let's get into it then. What's really interesting about Innis may be surprising. So this communications theory wasn't what he was famous for during his life.
Not at all. He was a big deal as an economic historian, right? Known for these huge studies, like a history of the Canadian Pacific Railway and the fur trade in Canada.
Absolutely. And, if it hadn't been for Marshall McLuhan later becoming such a star and pointing back to Innis,
His communication stuff might have just disappeared.
it's entirely possible it wouldn't even be in print today.
Yeah. Wow. So how did his early life kind of steer him towards this later shift?
Well, a few things really stand out. He grew up on a farm and his education was really impacted by World War I. He actually turned down early graduation, which was common then to get people enlisted. He wanted to finish his degree first, but it sort of left him feeling his education was compromised somehow. And then his time in the war itself. He was an artillery spotter at Vimy Ridge, April 1917.
A direct experience with military technology.
Exactly. And that raw experience, it really explains his lifelong ambivalence, his caution towards communications tech. Very different from McLuhan, who is much more, optimistic, almost utopian about it.
Right? McLuhan's global village vibe.
Very different. So, when Innis got back to the University of Toronto in 1920, he immediately started pushing back against the dominant view of Canadian history.
The British-centric one.
Yeah, the one that just saw the railway is this great technological fix that conquered Canada's geography. He questioned that narrative.
So he's looking at railways trade. How does that connect to media bias? Where's the bridge from, say, beaver pelts to communication theory?
That's his famous Staples thesis. He looked at things like fur, beaver pelts especially, and argued Canada's economy built on these staples didn't just overcome geography. Instead, the patterns of the trade, which were deeply shaped by the land and rivers, actually ended up supporting the Canadian state and dictating how Europeans and Indigenous peoples interacted.
So the commodity itself had a kind of structural influence.
Precisely. He later looked at pulp and paper the same way. But there's another layer too, maybe a bit more personal. Innis felt he needed to defend the idea of objective scholarship. There were critiques, especially from the left, saying social science couldn't be neutral.
Right?
So his communications work was partly his way of tackling that whole thorny issue of objectivity head-on, trying to understand the underlying biases even in knowledge.
Which must have seemed strange to his colleagues at the time.
Oh, definitely. His closest peers, the economic historians, the classicists, they were apparently quite puzzled, saw it as a weird detour from his real work.
Okay, so let's drill down into that core idea then, the bias of communication. What did he fundamentally argue?
He basically said that every civilization tends to lean on a dominant way of communicating, and that dominant form creates a bias, a kind of cultural tilt, either towards time or towards space.
A bias towards time or space.
Yeah, and he stressed that finding a perfect balance between the two, that's rare. Usually one dominates.
And this bias isn't just a small thing.
No, he argued. It's crucial, a key factor in why civilization rises, how it operates, and why it might eventually collapse. It's a huge idea. The medium isn't just a neutral container. It shapes the whole deal.
So the physical nature of the communication tool matters immensely. Can you break down those two biases? Time and space.
Sure. So first, you've got time. Biased media. Think heavy, durable stuff. Things not easily moved around, like writing on stone play tablets. Exactly. Or later, things like parchment, codices, handwritten books. These things last. They favor continuity, tradition, sin, memory. Yeah, because they're hard to make and move, right? They tend to lead to what he called monopolies of knowledge. Power gets concentrated in the hands of specialist scribes, priests who control the information.
Okay, that's time bias. What about space bias?
Space bias. Media are the opposite. Light easily transported.
Papyrus. Paper.
Papyrus. Yes. Then the alphabet made writing more flexible. Later, the printing press, the telegraph, radio. These things conquer distance.
So they help with trade, running big empires.
Absolutely. They facilitate administration over large areas, and at least initially, they can break up those older monopolies of knowledge. Someone like Lee, who Katz noted they give challengers ways and means for challenging existing monopolies, spread information wider.
But Innis wasn't saying space bias is automatically better, was he? It sounds more complicated.
Much more complicated. He saw a real interplay. For example, he argued that sure, initially things like newspapers and the telegraph gave farmers or trappers better access to market prices. That was empowering for them short term.
The long term.
Long term, these same fast media helped pull everyone, even the most remote person, into bigger and bigger systems, which paradoxically created new kinds of monopolies, cultural ones, economic ones, controlling both time and space, centralizing power in new ways.
Okay, so that sounds pretty pessimistic. Quite different from McLuhan's view you mentioned earlier.
Oh, very different. Innis was deeply skeptical about these vast monopolies of communication that emerged. He saw their negative effects quite clearly.
Whereas McLuhan was more excited by the potential.
You could say that McLuhan was definitely caught up in the rhetoric of the electrical sublime, this almost mystical belief in new technology. Innis, though, he was so wary he wouldn't even do radio shows or recorded interviews.
Really, he just refused.
Yup, shows his deep suspicion of mass media and popular culture. His own writing, especially later on, reflects this complexity too. It mixes deep theory with really detailed history.
And the style change.
His later essays became less linear, more like sketches painting these big, interconnected pictures. Maybe as his illness progressed, he was trying to show the whole sweep.
Fascinating. Okay, let's walk through some history then. How did Innis see these bias? This is actually shaping empires. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, let's start way back. Mesopotamia, in Egypt. In Mesopotamia, you have clay tablets, cuneiform writing, durable, last forever.
Time bias.
Definitely. And it fostered centralized control, powerful priesthoods, incredibly stable records. Think about their focus on time, the 7-day week, the base 60-number system from Babylon that all comes out of that bias.
And Egypt, they have papyrus, which is lighter, right?
Papyrus and hieroglyphics more space-biased. Initially, it might have allowed for more decentralization, but then combined papyrus with, say, horses and chariots for faster message delivery.
So even a space-biased medium could be used for central control.
Exactly. It could be used to manage a large territory effectively. Shows it's not just the medium, but how it's used in context with other technologies.
What about Greece and Rome? How did their communication methods fit in? Well, in Greece, Innis highlighted their really strong oral tradition, he thought, that actually supported democracy and acted as a check on the potential biases of purely written media. Interesting. But they did adopt writing more widely. They did, with the Ionic alphabet spreading, and Innis connects that to a rise in skepticism about the traditional gods, a shift in their cultural focus.
In Rome, all those roads.
Roads were key, facilitating control over space, and the church later relied heavily on parchment, which is durable like stone, but more portable than tablets, aiding administration and continuity. Roman law itself is very time-focused. Specific acts, specific time.
Even a calendar.
The calendar itself became a power tool. Think Julius Caesar, reforming it later. The church controlled the calendar, controlled timekeeping. It shows how even abstract systems reflect these media biases.
Okay, let's shift east. China invented paper and printing much earlier than Europe. How did that play out? According to N.S. Wright,
paper in the 2nd century AD, block printing around 868 AD. These came out of the needs of Buddhism and Confucianism. Really?
What was the effect?
It fostered a very powerful scholarly class, the Mandarins. But because access was still somewhat limited, it also meant that broader public opinion didn't have a huge amount of sway.
And then when printing hit Europe, we often think of that as revolutionary. Decentralizing
It was initially, it definitely helped spread vernacular languages, breaking the church's monopoly on Latin, empowering new groups, think the Reformation.
But in his Saw on Side 2,
he argued that ultimately print helped create the modern nation-state. These new monopolies of space nationalism, centralized governments controlling vast territories, so decentralizing in one way, centralizing in another.
Okay, fast forward to more modern times. Newspapers, telegraph, radio, TV. How did he see them fitting this pattern?
With newspapers, you see their early links to political parties. Think Swift or Defoe in England, using the press for political influence. Then advertising becomes a massive force, changing the content and focus.
And he felt this was bad for culture.
He worried it led to a focus on the immediate, the sensational. He felt the steadying influence of the book, which encourages deeper thought, was being destroyed by the faster pace of periodicals and news. A destruction of time, he called it.
Losing historical perspective.
Exactly. And then radio and TV. He saw them as even more centralizing, potentially lowering intellectual standards, focusing on the ephemeral and the superficial, things that grab attention now but don't last.
So putting it all together, it sounds like Innis had some pretty serious warnings for Western culture. He wasn't optimistic.
No, not really. He saw Western civilization as dangerously off balance, too focused on the present, blinded by its intense present-mindedness. He said,
which makes it more likely to
resort to force quick fixes instead of thoughtful long-term approaches. He was very critical of industrialism's values.
Also,
he talked about mechanized knowledge, creating new monopolies and fostering delusion, because the new media seemed more realistic, more immediate. but were actually narrowing perspectives.
And the focus on money.
Yes, the triumph of commercialism. He felt it destroyed a sense of time, this idea that time is money, valuing those 60 diamond minutes. He saw that as deeply problematic, a loss of deeper temporal perspective.
And he didn't just critique society in general, he specifically pointed fingers at universities too.
Absolutely. He had sharp words for universities, worried they could become just a branch of the military arm, or obsessed with fundraising above all else.
Seeing that as a kind of poisoning of education.
A systematic poisoning. Yes, he feared they'd lose their critical function.
So what was his ideal then? What should a university do?
He believed education should train people to judge information, how much they need, how little they need, to give them a sense of balance and proportion, and, crucially, to protect him from the fanatic.
How? By questioning things.
Constantly. Universities must constantly question assumptions, fight the tendency to accept dogma, actively destroy fanaticism. Their real job is to release mental energy, help students resist the pressures of mechanization and its biases.
He also had thoughts on adult education.
Yeah, he stressed it needed to tackle mature problems, engage adult capabilities, not just be an extension of basic schooling.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Bring it back to the listener. What does all this mean for you today? These ideas about media bias shaping empires might feel, I don't know, a bit abstract.
But they offer a really powerful way to look at our world right now, don't they? All this hyperconnectivity, the speed of information.
That core tension in U.S. saw, the bias of communication shaping how we see time, space, knowledge. It's not ancient history, it's happening all around us.
Absolutely. And think about this final point from Innis. He said culture is about our ability to appraise problems in terms of space and time, and enabling us to take the proper steps at the right time.
Having that balance, that perspective.
Exactly. So, given the speed of everything today at the constant present-mindedness he warned about, how can you cultivate that balance? How do you manage your own relationship with information to keep that sense of proportion?
Something to think about long after this D-dive ends.